I followed footprints through the fog one morning. They were the sort of prints you don't mistake for anything the woods usually leaves behind. Deep, wide, spaced long, like a slow heartbeat. I had been following prints like that off and on for 25 years, but never so close to my own cabin. I'd always thought the prints led away, toward somewhere else. That morning, they led in circles, skirted the porch, and stopped at a loose board I knew too well. I could hear my own heart under the quiet, and if I'm honest, I felt like I was stepping into a reckoning I'd been avoiding since Martha died. I still keep the Polaroids in a shoebox under the bed. I still have the journals, the cheap ballpoint scribbles that smudge if you breathe on them wrong. That morning, with the fog clinging to the firs and the creek sounding like a far-off radio, I reached down toward that board and remembered everything. How I'd come here, how he found me, how a life that looked finished found more to teach me than most men learn in a lifetime. If you like true encounters and long-form storytelling, subscribe. There are more stories in these pages, and that shoebox has a way of changing how people hear the world. 1973. I left the house the year after Martha's heart went quiet. We'd been married 21 years. She loved her begonias more than most things. She could name every song on the Eagles record she played on repeat the summer our daughter left for the city. Grief is a slow weather. It settles into things, into the curtains, into the taste of the coffee, into the sigh the house makes when the wind comes off the valley. I couldn't set the coffee pot humming anymore without thinking of her hand stopping it. I couldn't sit in the same chair and not feel an absence like an ache in a long bone. A friend from work, Tom Hriss, told me about the cabin. Cheap tax sales, nobody wanted it because the road in washed out every year and the county was stingy about repairs. It was small and crooked, half grown over with moss, and the sort of light that came through the trees in a way that made you forgive a place its imperfections. I told myself I was leaving for a while, just for a season. Everyone says that when they're trying not to admit it's forever. The first winter I was there, I found consolation in small things. The click of the wood stove, the way the stovepipe winked against the stars. Eagles cassettes on the 8-track, Martha songs, my memory of them, played until the tape chewed itself thin. I'd walk down to the creek in the afternoons because the water sounded like something honest. That creek is where I found him. He wasn't what the stories make you expect, no towering silhouette in the tree line with eyes like lamps. He lay half in the shallow bank, not moving except for a slow rise and fall of a chest too wide for my hands. A branch had snapped across his shoulder. There was a raggedness of fur and a smell like the wet leaves after rain. A friend from work, Tom Hriss, told me about the cabin. Cheap tax sales, nobody wanted it because the road in washed out every year and the county was stingy about repairs. It was small and crooked, half grown over with moss, and the sort of light that came through the trees in a way that made you forgive a place its imperfections. I told myself I was leaving for a while, just for a season. Everyone says that when they're trying not to admit it's forever. The first winter I was there, I found consolation in small things. The click of the wood stove, the way the stovepipe winked against the stars. Eagles cassettes on the 8-track, Martha songs, my memory of them, played until the tape chewed itself thin. I'd walk down to the creek in the afternoons because the water sounded like something honest. That creek is where I found him. He wasn't what the stories make you expect, no towering silhouette in the tree line with eyes like lamps. He lay half in the shallow bank, not moving except for a slow rise and fall of a chest too wide for my hands. A branch had snapped across his shoulder. There was a raggedness of fur and a smell like the wet leaves after rain. No footprints in the sawdust, no snapped twigs, just that silence that says someone was near and left kindly. I began to trust his intelligence, not the sort we get in newspapers or on talk radio, but a quiet, practical wit. He also taught patience in the most mortal of ways. Once, a group of college kids came up for a weekend and left the place in worse shape than the road. Beer cans, cigarette butts, trash like small wounds across the land. I yelled at them from the porch like a fool, and they left laughing. A week later, I found their empty bottles stacked under a fallen log, each one carefully buried. I couldn't decide whether to be furious or grateful. The act felt like a rebuke and an apology at once. I remember kneeling in the moss and feeling like an old man taking an exam he'd failed. There were brushes with danger. Hunters came through the mountains like weather fronts, some quietly, some with a voice that enjoyed being heard. I never accused anyone of cruelty. A barrel of hunters, and you'd find men who were more show than harm. And then there were those who made the woods a place they owned by the sound of their boots. Once, a hunting party came close enough to the creek that August and I both could hear their laughter, and then one of them fired. The shot missed everything important, but it made them scatter like startled birds, and left something like a rift in the days afterward. August withdrew for months that time. I thought I'd lost him for good. When he returned, he moved like a man who'd learned the cost of trust. He wouldn't come into the open for long, but he left signs. Stone spirals so intricately made I could trace the motion of the hands that made them. Sometimes the spirals had a small line of white feathers or a knot of his fur tied with root fiber. Once he left a fish on the threshold of my stove. I cried over that fish because grief makes you do things you never thought you would. I cried because the world kept offering me more to carry. I kept journals because I am a man who needs to set things down. Not all the journals are worth reading, flurries of sentences I couldn't give rhythm to, fishing lists and gas prices. Johnny told me once the price in '79 was record-breaking, and I wrote it down because it anchored the moment. But in those journals I wrote about August. I wrote what time he came, how he smelled after rain, the way his eyes would focus on a single point until the rest of the world blurred. I learned to document because men who live with strange things often end up accused of the strangest sins, lying, exaggerating, wanting attention. I wanted to have something real when people pressed, something honest to give them that wasn't just the memory of a man alone in the woods. Polaroids came later. I bought a Spectra on a whim late one autumn when the nights began to arrive earlier. Polaroids have a way of making things urgent. You point the camera at a moment, and the image coughs into being, an argument that time can be held, briefly, on glossy paper. The first few I took were useless. A blurred ridge of trees, the steam of my breath, a smear like a bruise. The first one of August that came through the chemicals looked like a smudge at first. Then the face resolved, grainy, and somehow softer than my memory. I slid it into a book. I kept them in the shoebox not because I feared being believed, but because belief in the wrong hands can become spectacle. I didn't want August to be a show on a diner wall. I learned small rules. Never chase, never try to feed in public, keep the offerings modest. We traded in a slow, creaturely barter, food for presents, stones for keeping, quiet for teaching. He taught me better patience than any self-help pamphlet ever could. There were days when he would sit like a pillar across the creek and make no motion, his attention entirely on the water. He taught me to sit and watch him watch. Watching him watch taught me to occupy silence differently. Silence is not absence. Sometimes it is intention. Not everything the forest taught me was gentle. The 1980s brought more men in trucks, clear-cutting edges visible like scars from the road. The logging moved like hunger, mechanical and unapologetic. Where there had been understory, there was now a fringe of stumps. I sat on my porch and listened to the distant thump of machines and felt a tightening in the chest like the moment before a storm breaks. August came less often after that. When he did come, he was skittish, his eyes flicking where they used to rest. Once I tracked him to a boundary where the clear cut stopped and the old forest began. He stood on the last patch of green and threw stones into the cut zone, one after another, in no pattern I could find. They looked like a protest or a counting of what had been taken. There was a time I thought we'd be safe from all that. Small cabins and old men in them have a way of feeling exempt. I found out the hard way that nothing is exempt. A neighbor told me about a crew working a road in '94. They moved faster than people expected and left machines where they shouldn't be. August went away for nearly a year after that. I wore all my jackets as a kind of armor and listened for his steps like a man waiting for an epistle. When he came back, he came with a limp and a sorrow like an animal that had been betrayed by the world's appetite. We kept each other company as two things living at the edge of being forgotten. There were moments of tenderness that tasted like iron. Once, when Martha's birthday arrived, I had kept a small cake that year and lit a single candle. August came and sat across from me. He watched the flame as if memorizing the way it fought the dark. He placed a circle of stones around the candle, nothing elaborate, just stones. He left without touching the cake. I wept in front of him like a man who thinks the rules of public grief have no place when a creature who is not meant to understand us understands anyway. He did not offer explanations. There were no words, only presence, which is often more than words. People have asked why I kept it a secret. Some days I think it was cowardice. Some days I think it was mercy. You can make something sacred by how you guard it. I didn't want to make August a tourist trap or a sideshow. I wanted him to be a real creature that taught just a single person important things. There's a kind of intimacy in that, the knowledge that something else in the world remembers you not as a curiosity, but as someone who listened. In the late '80s, I met a woman who walked the ridge for exercise. She was a volunteer for a land trust and had bright eyes that saw the forest in a way that made me think of a child with a magnifying glass. She asked me once if I kept the land as a private thing or if I'd consider letting the trust put a small conservation easement on it. I told her to leave it as is. "I'm selfish," I said. She smiled and said that sometimes that's the only way to keep a thing whole. I thought of that when the logging machines rolled in closer. I can trace years by details that most people would find worthless. The year I bought a new pair of boots, the year the gas hovered over $1.30, the year MTV started playing in the diner. The world kept changing, and I kept a little island where the creek still had its honest music. August's fur grew a shade grayer, as if he too was cataloging time. I grew older in the way old men do. The knees slip, the back whispers, memory misplaces names like loose change. The Polaroids multiplied, then stopped. There's a practical thing about film. It runs out if you stop feeding it. There's also a moral thing. Photographs complicate things. Once, a kid in town named Jimmy caught a glimpse of one of the pictures when he came by on an errand and asked if he could borrow it. I said no. I was too protective of that image, as if the photograph itself contained the essence of what had happened, and if he looked at it too long, it would unravel. The shoebox stayed in the same place for years, beneath the bed, in the dark, smelling faintly of cedar and dust and the particular musk of an old life. In the later years, by the time the '90s were rounding into the '90s proper, August started bringing different things, not just fish or stones, but arrangements that seemed to speak to an idea of memory. He'd place a curl of his own fur in a hollow of a tree and set a white petal beside it. Once, he left a small pile of objects under the porch. A bone cleaned like someone had taken time to attend to it, a strip of cloth, perhaps snagged from a pack, and a pebble engraved in the subtle way of a river rock. I remember finding them in the hours before dawn, hands still smelling of coffee, and feeling that same flip of the world seen backwards that grief does. This is both a gift and an accusation. It was around that time I began to suspect he kept a memory of me somewhere I wouldn't look. I started noticing small disturbances on the porch, loose boards, scratches where none had been before. Once, when I went out with the headlamp to check the animals, I found a line of stones leading from the doorstep to the woods, carefully arranged as if someone were making a small path of words. I could read them because my life had taught me bookkeeping for little gestures. Each stone was chosen, not random, and I imagined his hands, the way the pads of his fingers would press into moss, and I felt seen in a way that makes a man both naked and blessed. There were days when I tried to document everything. The time he sat and watched a train go by, the way he copied the curve of my wave after I caught him watching me. I taught him a wave after a while, just a twitch of the hand, and he would sit at a distance and mimic it like a schoolchild. It was one of the few tricks he didn't tire of. Once a neighbor saw that mimic and called me eccentric again, but some things are worth being eccentric over. The town stayed its small orbit. People aged and died. New faces came and left. The world outside my patch of trees began to get louder. In '98, I was 70, my hair a thin silver, and August was slower but steadier than I was. That March morning, March 15th, he came to the porch not as a teacher, but as a friend. He sat on the log by the stove and made the low rumble that felt like an old benediction. I don't have those words in the normal sense. I have the impression of being blessed. He leaned his great shoulder against the post and rested his head like a man who knows his work is done. After that, the visits became less frequent. A part of me always thought some ending would come quietly, like fog burning off the river. I was wrong, and I was right. Roads get paved where you don't expect them. Men get older and move their attention the way weather turns. I had plans I never told anyone about. I put the Polaroids in the shoebox and wrote a series of simple, rambling lines in the journal. Who visited, what time, what he left. It became a ritual as sacred as any prayer. Some nights I would open the box and hold the photographs under my lamp, watching the images like small confessions. The footprints I followed that morning had a story written into them. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soggy ground after a rain. I could tell by the way the mud pooled in the toes. They led around the porch in a careful arc, then walked straight to the spot where the board was loose. I had seen that looseness for years, but never made the connection until then. Maybe that's because we don't like our memories challenged. Maybe it's because when it's your own porch, you assume the disturbances are your fault. The dog, the raccoon, the freeze-thaw of winter. This time, there was intention in the tracks. They told me someone had come to leave something where I'd be certain to find it. I followed them soft-footed, the way men growing hunches learn to move. The cold had a smell, stone and wood smoke, and a crow called like a loose hinge. I came to the board and felt the familiar give beneath my palm. The board had been loose all my life, or at least it seemed that way. My fingers were older and smelled like the cedar from the closet I'd sanded that winter. As my skin touched the grain, it felt different, like it had been handled recently. There are moments that slow like a river pool. Time compresses and stretches. I felt that then. A scratching of leaves behind me, the soft scrape of a boot in mud, and the realization that whatever lay under that board was not an accident. I reached down, one hand steady, the other holding the edge of the porch as if I needed to anchor myself to the world. My fingers found the board and worked the nails back with a small crowbar I keep for stubborn pieces of lumber. One by one, the nails gave, and the board lifted with the smell of old sap and dust. For a moment, I saw my own hands in the development of the Polaroids, slow, careful, the way images reveal themselves if you have patience. The gap under the porch opened like a secret. Something shifted in me then, an old man's breath caught between a laugh and a sob. I had followed prints for decades, and never before did they lead straight to my own door. The thought that he had chosen this small place as a site to store memory felt like a sacrament. There are many definitions of the word buried. Some things are buried to hide them, some are buried to keep them safe. I felt both meanings at once. I reached my arm in, and my fingertips brushed against something soft and oddly warm in the chill. It wasn't alive. It was not what television had taught a man to fear. It was a bundle, wrapped with a care I recognized. Stones balanced around it like guard posts, a circle of small, flat river rocks laid in a pattern I'd seen by the creek. The sound the stones made when my hand disturbed them was delicate, like rain on an old tin. For a second, everything rushed: the first splint, the first fish, the stone spirals, the long times of waiting. I could hear the creak, the 8-track tape, the stove, and the rattle of a faraway chainsaw, as if they were on separate channels, and someone was turning the volume down on everything but that single, small breath. The world seemed to hinge on that bundle beneath the floorboards. I think I let out a sound, more like a relinquishment than a cry, a thing I have kept secret because some truths feel indecent until you see them held. I pulled the bundle free and felt the weight of it in my palm. It was wrapped in a strip of cloth, tied with root fiber, and as I lifted it into the light, I could make out the texture of fur peeking out from an edge, as if someone had chosen that specific piece for the softness of memory. There was also the curl of a little photograph, browned by time at the edges. My hands trembled in my old way. I could smell him: musk, rain, the inside of pines. I remember thinking then, with a clarity that hurt, that this was deliberately placed. This was not the random hoard of an animal. This was an offering. Someone or something had taken the trouble to bury a memory beneath my floor, as if ensuring that the person it remembered would be certain to find it. That's where the story stopped for a long while in my head. I sat on the porch with the bundle in my lap and felt like a man who had been given both a benediction and a summons. There are choices a man makes with a find: expose it, keep it, announce it to the world and invite a stadium of opinions, or tuck it away and let the larger world go on ignorant. I had been doing the latter for years out of respect and fear. The bundle pressed against my palms and asked a different question. I did not lift the cloth all the way then. I rested my forehead against my knees and let the morning go on without me. The fog thinned to strips of blue. The creek kept its honest counsel, and a woodpecker began its staccato on a far tree. There was a particular silence that felt like counseling. I felt August's presence like a taut string across a throat. I felt his teaching. Presence is a practice, memory is a language, and some trustings are sacred work. I put the board back gently after that, as if not to disturb whatever else might be under there. I slid the bundle into my coat and went inside to light the stove, hands clumsy from the cold. The shoebox under the bed hummed in my mind. Photographs, journals. The things we keep are not always physical. Sometimes they are the small contracts we make with ourselves. I made one in that moment. I would not rush the unwrapping. I would let the discovery sit with me and teach me as August had taught in so many ways. There is an impatience in human nature that always wants the reveal, the headline, the neat closure. I had spent a life avoiding that, and yet here was the temptation. I carried the bundle to the table and set it by a lamp. Its shadow lay across the journal I'd been keeping since the 70s, the pen with a frayed cap beside it. I thumbed the pages for the entry when I had first decided to name him, and found the line where I'd written, in a hand that looks younger to me now, "He watches like a man who keeps accounts." The sentence looked small and true on the page. Then I made coffee, and the kettle whistled in a thin, high way that set me to thinking of Martha and of the way she could whistle without warning. The day arrived with a patience that felt like late mercy. I sat and stared at the lamp and the bundle, and felt all the years like the slow stack of stones August once made for me. There are decisions a man delays because the world asks for proof before it will give you solace. But some proofs are not meant for others. They are meant to be tended like a small flame by the person who has been entrusted with them. It is one of the cruelties of life that we must choose which flames to risk showing. I put the bundle inside my coat, tucking it under my arm like a sheep I was carrying home, and went to the window. The footprints in the mud glistened in the late light. They were gone now, as if whoever had made them had decided their work was finished. I thought of August standing at the far edge of the trees, watching the sun do the slow business of setting. I thought of stones arranged shell-like on the creek bank, and the way he had once pushed a pebble off the edge as if asking me to notice the small things of consequence. I did not open that bundle that night. I sat on the porch and thought about the long list of lessons he'd taught me, and felt the shape of my life as if it were a book I'd mislaid. I am an old man, and old people find themselves tender about small things. I kept the photographs and journals locked in their place and slept with the knowledge that I had found something that morning that shifted how I understood our relationship. If he had intended this as proof, it was proof not of a myth, but of a memory shared between us. In the days that followed, I walked more slowly. I paid attention to the small quietings of the forest, the way a leaf would fall differently now that there were fewer understory plants to break its descent, the way the creek's voice sounded when the rain changed. People in town asked if I planned to put the place into a trust. I smiled and gave the small answer that is true, maybe. There is a moral urgency to preservation that feels like a command sometimes, as if the forest were asking us to hold it like a child. I kept the bundle where it would not be seen. I read the journals and let the Polaroid fade in and out of sight. Once, late at night, I found myself lifting the cloth and laying out the objects on the kitchen table. A curl of his fur, a stone with a white vein, the browned photograph tucked like a secret. The photograph, when it came into focus under a lamp, was not dramatic. It was a soft thing, an image of a shoulder, of the way light sits on fur, of a hand maybe, though the edges blurred. Someone could look at it and call it a trick of light. Someone could look at it and say it was nothing. For me, it was a summoning. That is where I left it for a while, an ember that glowed if I breathed on it. August came and went in the seasons that followed, fewer visits, but deeper. He would sit and hum that low sound and sometimes place another stone arrangement somewhere I would find it. I never learned everything he might have been trying to say.
Lessons are not always tidy things with bullet points you can take into a meeting. They are more like wet paint, a touch and a smear, and you live with the impression. I began to think more and more about what we lose when we fail to notice. The logging that chewed across the hills, the hunters who sometimes came too close, the kids who thought the woods were a place to leave behind their empties, all of it felt like a distraction from the main task of being alive. August taught me that looking, really looking, is a practice. You look and you wait, and sometimes things come to you because you gave them the space to. A year or so after that morning with the footprints, I found more prints near the road. They were not the same as the ones on the porch. These were newer and crossed the gravel like a thought wandering. I followed them for a time, not because I expected an answer, but because following had become a way of staying honest. The path led toward the old boundary, where the clear-cut had stopped years before, and the young growth had started to mend. There, in a stand of new firs, I found a circle of stones laid just the way he liked to do, small, deliberate, holding a space open. In the center of that circle was a small, crudely written thing, a piece of wood with a mark burned into it. It looked like a tally. It looked like an accounting of what had been taken or what had been kept. I stood there with my hands in my pockets and felt the weight of the world tilt on a small pivot. I have told you this long because the morning I lifted the board and found the bundle did not come out of nowhere. It was the end of a long series of small attentions, of things I had earned by being present even when presence cost more than I thought it would. There are larger stories about creatures and conspiracies on late-night radio. This isn't one of those. What I found under the cabin was not the kind of evidence meant to save debates in a paper. It was a thing placed by a being with the capacity to remember and to commemorate. That kind of thing changes a man in a way that's quieter than a headline. It rearranges the furniture of your life. I am an old man now. My hands remember the grain of that board and the heft of the bundle the way they remember the calluses of past labors. I have carried that thing with me in my mind and in my pocket and in my heart. It was a trust extended across species, perhaps, or maybe a gesture of mourning from one creature to another. Either way, it asked for something not of commerce, but of care. And so I followed the prince again, months after the first time, because habit and longing are a pair. I wanted to see if anything else had been left, if there were further signs of a language I was still learning. The prince took me in a circle this time, as if to remind me the world doesn't always move forward in a straight line. They led to the place behind the woodpile where the moss grows thick and the air tastes like the bones of trees. There was a new scrape along the earth, and a feather, this pale, this impossible thing. I bent to pick it up and felt my knees grate in a way they hadn't in years. I held the feather between my thumb and forefinger and remembered August's head bent toward me and the time he laid a stone for Martha's birthday. That morning, with the feather still in my hand, I heard a distant sound, a ruffle of movement like a cloak across brush, and I knew without turning that someone watched me. There is a kind of seeing that feels like the world acknowledging you. I stayed where I was because I'd learned over the years that movement can break trust. He stepped into view, not hidden by narrative, but plainly, like someone who has come to sit and watch the world keep turning. He nodded once, a small dip of his great head, and then he walked away as if to say, "I did this for you. I remember." There are people who will read this and want names and coordinates and proof pinned to graphs. I have tried to balance proof with privacy. There is a difference between making the world understand and asking the world to respect a sanctuary. I chose the latter. The bundle beneath the porch stayed wrapped for months. It was an anchor I could touch when the nights grew too lonely. This is where I'll leave you for now, with a man who learned to be taught by a creature nobody around him seemed able to name, with prints that came and went like weather, with a board that hid a small, tender thing beneath the floor of a crooked little cabin. I have more to tell, how townspeople started to wander closer, how the logging moved nearer, how August's visits grew patchy and then more rare, and how the bundle finally changed what I did with my life. But that comes later. For now, understand this. Sometimes the most shocking discoveries are not about monsters, but about the capacity of other beings to remember, and the accounts we keep with each other that demand we act differently. If you've stayed with me this far, there's more in the shoebox beneath the bed. Photographs, scribbles, the soft record of a life that learned to listen. In time, I will tell you what I found beneath that board, and what it meant to my body and to my conscience. For now, the bundle sits under the lamp, and the daylight comes and goes, and I wait like a man who has been shown, finally, how to be quiet and present in the only ways that matter. I did not open the bundle that first day, because some discoveries ask you to learn patience all over again. I had found it in a way that felt like a benediction and a test both. August had taken the trouble to hide memory where only I would be likely to find it, and the finding forced a decision I had been postponing for years. What you do with a gift that asks to be kept is as much about ethics as it is about emotion. The next week, I coaxed the stove into something like life and set the lamp on the table. Morning came slow, and I made the sort of weak coffee that tastes like temperance and thrift. The shoebox of Polaroids and the journals were already open on the bed like a small altar. The bundle sat on the table like a thing that had been entrusted to me by someone who did not ask for words in return. I lit the lamp and sat until the light took the room in its arms. When I unwrapped it, I did so like a man who knew a child was watching, careful not to tear the edges, mindful of the way small rituals arrive whole only if respect is kept. Inside, folded in a strip of cloth, were 3 things:
A tuft of fur, coarse and darkened at the tips as if kissed by many rains. A folded piece of glossy paper that had been a Polaroid once, its image softened by time but still stubborn, and a ring of small river stones, each smoothed to the same size as if chosen with particular hands. The river stones were arranged in a tiny spiral, the center empty, as if the maker had left a room for a heart to fit. The photograph was not the sort of clear portrait you might see in a family album. It was a fragment, a shoulder, a sweep of fur, and the suggestion of a hand half in shadow. When I held it to the light and tried to remember the day the image was taken, there was a slow weaving of memory. I had taken pictures of him, yes, willing, secret images that felt too intimate to show. But this photograph did not match any of mine exactly. The angle suggested someone else had taken it, from a cover of brush, or that the camera had been set and left to make itself. The edges were softened like old film, and across the back someone had pressed a simple mark into the emulsion, a little incision that looked like a notch, a counting mark. It was not my handwriting. It was not any handwriting I could name. The shock, the thing that made my chest hollow out, came when my fingers met the little spiral of river stones. I recognized the arrangement because I had watched him make that very pattern by the creek. The slow, clockwise gesture of his hands, the way he pressed each pebble into moss like an offering. I had always assumed those spirals were tokens, or perhaps something he made because the motion itself pleased him. Seeing a spiral tucked into a bundle under my floor did something odd. It flipped the object into a sentence. Someone, or something, had assembled a reliquary of our passing. The fur, the photograph, the stone spiral. Together they read like a wordless speech. I remember you. You learn, as time goes by, that memory is a fragile thing, easily trampled, easily traded away for a quick story or a laugh. To be recognized in another being's memory is rarer than a good harvest in an old man's life. I held the fur between thumb and forefinger and felt the tiny needles against my skin. It smelled of rain and the inside of furs, of musk that was not unpleasant, the way an old wool sweater can smell like a winter you once wore. The test in that moment was not whether it proved anything to a stranger. The test was whether I would let this act of remembering change me. I am not a man with a tender streak for public spectacle. My instinct has always been preservation in the small sense. Keep the book closed, keep the door latched, keep a secret, because some things deserve privacy. But the bundle made other demands. It asked for a stewardship that went beyond possession, an ethical shaping of what memory would mean for the land and the living. I thought of the woman from the land trust and her bright, sideways faith in conservation. I thought of Tom Harris, who could make a crude bench from a fallen log and say something useful about the way people hold on to things. I thought of Martha and how she was the one who taught me to name a thing to keep it safe. That same week, I walked into town for a spool of twine and some groceries, and Dale at the feed store asked me if anything new had been happening up at the cabin. There is a politeness in those questions that masks curiosity. I told him the truth in the small way I often did. I said the nights were quiet and the creek ran cold, and the feed store men chuckled and passed cans across the counter. News has a way of stretching in small places. I had not told a soul about the bundle, and I intended to keep it that way. But secrets are not always kept by silence alone. The nature of curiosity is that it multiplies. A boy named Jimmy, who worked at the diner, had once caught a quick glimpse of a Polaroid I had used as a bookmark, and that incident had made me stricter. After the bundle, I was stricter still. I wrapped the stones and the fur in acid-free tissue, an affectation perhaps, but I had learned that things kept with care last longer. And I placed them in the cedar box with the Polaroids and the journals. I kept the key in the pocket of my overcoat. The presence of that key was a comfort like an amulet. The world, meanwhile, kept shifting. In the late 90s, the logging came closer than anyone had expected. Machines commute across country roads the way tourists commute across a town, slow and oblivious. The sound of a chainsaw is like a clock with bad manners. It tells you time is passing and that nothing listens.
There were meetings at the VFW, there were petitions folded and refolded, there were men who argued that progress had an appetite. I sat in the back of those meetings and let others speak. There is a humility in being older that feels like listening to a long orchestra as it forgets the tune you liked. When the logging crews opened another face to the hillside, the forest reacted with the usual quiet horror. Fledgling gullies of light where shade had been, understory eaten to stub, the place where deer rubbed shoulders now rimmed by dirt. August came less often in those years. When he did come, he had the slump of a beast that had learned what losses look like. I learned his ways for grief because they were less show than ritual. He would move to the threshold of the clearing, plant his feet, and kick at the mulched debris, making no order. Once, on a bitter morning, I watched him collect a length of twisted wire and lay it in a straight line along the creek bank like a seam. When I knelt and touched it, the metal was cold and the bark around it stained black with some sort of oil. It was then I understood that my small life and the creature's life shared the same weather of consequences. There were younger men who drove in a truck now and again, who climbed the ridge to take photos with the casual cruelty of weekend treasure hunters. I met them once on the road and told them in a voice thin with age that the land was not theirs to collect. They laughed and said a man like me held on to things that looked like ghosts. I thought then of the bundle under the board and the way a creature had made an archive, because archives can be a protest against forgetting. Some protests are loud, some are wrapped and tucked. On a wet evening sometime in '99, a group of teenagers from the college came up to the ridge and made a camp near my property line. They drank, they shouted, they left bottles like small moons among the ferns. I remembered the time the kids left trash near the creek and how August had stacked the bottles and buried them as if reproving us with a secret. That night I went down to tell them to quiet. My voice had the brittle quality of someone who'd sharpened it on lonely years. I found, instead, one of the young men balancing stones near the old boundary in the way I had seen August do. He muttered something about art and then called across to his friends as if daring them to look. I said nothing then because I have learned that silence can sometimes stop more damage than words. Still, the thought that our small rituals could be mimicked without the weight of meaning in them made me uneasy. The shoebox became both repository and judge. When the nights felt too long, I would pull the box, press the Polaroids under the lamp, and let the images, grainy and faithful, come to me. Each photograph seemed to change the room, a memory that made the walls expand and contract. Sometimes I would lay out the items from the bundle on the kitchen table and match them to entries in the journal. The journal had a stubborn line I had written in '82. He leaves me stones like little islands of proof. It read now both as observation and as prayer. The presence of those things changed how I acted in small ways. At first, it was practical. I mended the porch the way one mends a wound you think might be re-injured. I hammered nails, replaced boards, stained what had once been raw wood. But the interior change was gentler and more dangerous. I wanted to protect the land not just for myself, but for the possibility of being remembered by other than human things. It is one thing to save a view, it is another to save a context where a creature might remember a person. I had a friend across the valley, Tom Hriss, who had more curiosity than most men carry in a lifetime. He could read the grain of a log like scripture and carve furniture that looked as if it had always been there. In the summer of 2001, I told him one small part of the truth. Not the location, not the photographs, not the precise contents, but the fact that I had been entrusted with things under the floor. He asked me why I had kept them secret. I told him about the fear of spectacle. He listened without the impatience of most people. "You want to protect a thing," he said simply, "don't you? Not from memory, but from the way memory becomes a commodity." I nodded. He took another boot off and cleaned a notch in a piece of walnut he had been working on and said nothing more.
We met one rainy afternoon, and Tom, who was never given to fine gestures, suggested I talk to the woman from the land trust again. There are ways to keep a place from being harvested without turning it into a museum, he said. You can write a deed that says what happens and what doesn't. The woman's name was Leela. She had been the bright-eyed volunteer who walked the ridge in the late 80s. I had brushed her off before, selfish as I felt, because there is a private grief in hoarding the last places that are ours. Now, with the bundle in the cedar box under my hand, I found the private hoarding had a hollowness to it. The privacy felt less like protection of August and more like keeping a jewel so no one else could see its light. So I met Leela at the coffee shop by the post office, with the shoebox buried in a plastic bag beneath my coat like contraband. I told her something of the story, not the parts that would send men out with rifles and recorders, but the parts that mattered. That the land had been witness to things I could not explain fully, that I believed someone or something else kept accounts, and that I wanted the land to remain whole. Her face took on that serious, pleased expression that people get when they can finally turn a sad thing into a plan. We drew up papers in the years that followed. I insisted on conditions that read like a small liturgy. No public tours, no commercialization, no research in the sense of trophy seeking. The conservation easement we settled on protected the creek buffer and extended a line of protection around the cabin and its nearest trees. It was not a grand gift, and it did not make headlines. It simply recorded a set of promises between me and the land trust, promises that would hold after I could not keep them myself. There is a humility in legal papers. They are a way of forcing future people to remember an old man's requests.
I signed the documents with a hand that quivered only a little. The land trust committed to a stewardship plan that emphasized quiet and monitoring for harm. They did not ask for the photographs. They only promised to maintain the land. I felt relief like an old chain oiling. August, in these years, came on and off. The visits were fewer, but each one carried the weight of something nearing completion. He would sit on the log and hum that low sound, and stay with me through hour-long silences. Once, when my knees were particularly bad, he took a stone and rolled it to me as a gift. He did not touch my hand the way a man might shake a friend's. There were limits he kept. He stayed mostly in the peripheries, which made his presence no less intimate. It was companionable. It was also, inevitably, finite. Then there was March 15, 1998, the visit I had written about in the journal with a careful hand. He sat against the post and made the sound that felt like benediction. I have told this a dozen times, and every time the telling erodes the particularity of it. What mattered was not the date so much as the quality of the act. A creature came and sat like a mourner, breathed in the same air as a man who had lost a wife decades before, and offered a small arrangement of stones at his feet. It was not heroics, it was presence. To be present with another creature's grief is perhaps the most radical kindness known to us. Time is less charitable than memory wants it to be. It carries you forward with the inexorable calm of weather. By 2003, my body had started making its own demands. I went to see a doctor for a heart thing that turned out to be more about the rest of me than the one problem. The stare at the cabin was growing steeper in the mind of its owner. There was paperwork that needed signing. There was a gentle, practical insistence from my daughter, who had long ago settled in the city, that I consider assisted living so she could worry less. She and I spoke with the same soft, private chords. She knew about the cabin in the way a child knows the outline of a family story, but not all of its textures. When the decision came to place the key under a lock with more people holding the other side, it was not easy. I had pledged to Leela and the land trust that the place would remain under conservation. I had also promised myself the simpleness of keeping the box of things close. The place where those promises met was a narrow path, and I walked it with a careful step.
I made instructions that the cedar box was to remain sealed and in my possession while I lived. After I was gone, the land trust would be the steward of the land, but not of the private archive, unless I left explicit permission. It felt like a proper balance. Some things should outlive you only as caretakers' obligations, not as curiosities in a museum. Moving day was a slow, inconspicuous sort of grief. Men put my clocks in boxes and closed doors.
My daughter packed the shoebox in a bag and handed me the key to the cedar box. I put the box in my coat like a child carrying a pet. The cabin looked smaller when I left it, not because its walls had shrunk, but because my place in it had been that which revolutionizes a room's size. August did not visit the day I left. To be honest, I had not expected him to. He had been a creature of manners and of boundaries. He understood endings in a way that had no noise. Years passed and the world kept shifting its pitch. The land got quieter in some ways and louder in others. A new family bought a parcel a mile down the road and put up a cabin with solar panels and bright windows. Neighbors changed. The diner got a new owner who played different music. The land trust kept its promises. They did not stage tours. They maintained the buffers and watched the edges. Once I received a letter with a photograph of a hedgerow, neatly labeled and stamped with a happy quarterly note about invasive species. I liked the bureaucratic kindness of that small check-in. The shoebox lived in my closet in assisted living for a long time. I took it out sometimes at night and set the Polaroids under the lamp and tried to read the faces that had been recorded. The photographs are stubborn things. They will not yield everything, and they do not demand to. The fur remained in its little tissue, like a relic should stay, soft, useless to most, but heavy in meaning. In the years after I moved, people who visit a man in assisted living tend to ask him the sorts of questions that are short and circular. They ask about the weather, about whether he wants tea, about whether the stories are true. I answer the way an old man answers, with the truth inside many adjectives. There was a time, some years into my new life, when I was visited by a young man from the land trust. He had come to deliver a package, maps of the property, a schedule of monitoring. I kept him for a long time, because old people like to be heard. At the end of our talk, he asked if there was anything else he ought to know. The earth is generous in what it will give you when you need to be honest. I told him about the bundle beneath the board, but I told it not as a public report, but as a charge. He put his hand on the table and said nothing for a long while. "We'll honor your request," he said finally. The words were small and adequate. I left it at that. I never brought the shoebox out to show anyone, except once and only once, to Tom. He came with a thermos of coffee and the smell of cedar tools. He sat on the edge of my bed and I poured coffee and we opened the box together. He did not cluck and tell me I ought to show it to the paper. He held the photograph as if it were a small animal and nodded. "This is a record," he said, and he meant it with respect. I asked him to promise he would not speak of it, and he promised because Tom keeps covenants. He is that sort of slow man. I trusted him because trust is part of how a man learns to keep his oath. There are, I have found, levels of grief. There is the shapelessness that comes right after a loss. There is the practical reorganization we do to keep living. And there is the sort of saintly patience that comes from being taught by another creature how to simply sit with what is. August taught me presence, but he also taught me the moral architecture of care, that we must sometimes do the inconvenient thing for the sake of what is not ours to sell. That knowledge became the gentle engine that moved me to work with the land trust and to create little hedges of protection around a place where something else could remember. As the years moved on, August's visits tapered to a handful. There were times I did not see him for a whole season. There were times I thought the visits had ceased for good. Then, sometimes, when the snow was thin and the air had the hard breath of early spring, he would come and sit like a shadow of the man I had been in my younger years. He would place stones in the little ways I had seen him do since 1973. Spirals, straight lines, half-moons, and I would nod in a way that meant thank you. There was, in that exchange, a depth I will never fully have words for. He died, or perhaps he did not die in the way men do. You cannot, with the evidence on hand, insist to the rest of the world what sort of end he had. I will say only that there came a winter when his visits ceased, and that I never again heard that low, deep rumble that had comforted me more than any prayer. The last time I saw him was the March morning I have written of. I held the memory like a folded shirt and kept it close. I told myself that if his passing was not as human bodies pass, then at least his leaving was dignified. Both are kinds of grace in their own way. After he stopped coming, I would sometimes go out to the porch and lift the loose board, half hoping for another small package. None came. The footprints in the mud dried, and the moss grew back where they had compressed it. But the thing under the floor had been found, and the knowledge of its existence changed the orders of my days. I did not, as some would expect, take it to the town hall and declare a miracle. I let it remain a private thing, and in that privacy I made my routine as if tending a small shrine. The journals, the Polaroids, the cedar box, the key. At night, in the assisted living bed, I would hold the photograph up to the window and watch the light make strange new faces out of the grain. People there are patient with the eccentricities of old men. Some of their eyes have the same kind of kindness that makes a quiet town keep an old shopkeeper a little longer than it should. My daughter would come and sit, and we would look at the photograph together. She never asked for the location or for details she did not need. Children of grieving parents learn discretion out of love. When people ask whether I have proof, whether the bundle is definitive, you must understand what proof means to different people. For a scientist with a ledger and a hypothesis, this is circumstantial: a photograph, a fur, a ring of stones. For me, it is a different kind of evidence. It is testimony and alter both. It tells me that another life made an account and wished me to be an heir to it. That is the sort of proof that moves a man to adjust his moral compass. I have come to see that August's acts of remembering, his gifts, his stones, the bundle under my board, were less about persuading a skeptical audience and more about making a pact. He made his pact with me in a way I could understand, with small objects and the language of stones. In return, my pact was to make choices that would keep the possibility of being remembered alive for others. It felt like an ethical transaction, one creature's trust for another's care. Now, at my age, there is the particular urgency of the old who know the slope of time. Memory is a combustible thing. It thrives on attention, or else it is blown away. I have tried, in my small, stubborn way, to pay attention. I have written down the dates, the small coordinates of visits, the times when the spiral stones appeared and when they did not. I have kept the photographs and the journal, and I have left instructions that the land be preserved. That is the best I can do, a set of modest, enforceable actions that may allow the next person to be less fragile than I have been. Last winter, I opened the cedar box again for reasons I cannot fully explain. Perhaps I wanted to hear the rustle of cloth in my hands. Perhaps I wanted the comfort of proof. I spread the objects on my lap and let the memory come like the tide. The fur was softer than I remembered, and the photograph, when held to the light, made a small shape that my eyes knew intimately. The stone spiral still fit in a palm. I held them, and I thought of Martha's hands arranging begonias, and the way she would tuck a fallen petal into my palm as if it were a sacred thing. In the afternoon, the young volunteer from the land trust called to say they were setting up another monitoring walk and invited me to come stand at the edge of the driveway if I felt up to it. I said no at first because I am a private man, but then I changed my mind and went out with my daughter. We walked slowly along the ridge and watched the monitors take notes and mark points on their maps. A young student asked my daughter if she had always lived there because he liked the look of the old house. She smiled and said, "My father loves that house." It was an answer that protected more than it revealed. You may be wondering why I am telling you all this now, at the end of my life. I have kept the secret for long enough that it has become its own sort of memory. I suppose I am ready to carry less of it alone. There is a moral urgency to pass on the idea that other lives, other than human lives, are not merely surf that laps at the shore of our self-importance. They bear accounts, they keep marks, and when they make an offering, it is our moral work to receive it in the spirit it was given. So this is the last of what I will tell. I followed those footprints to the porch, and under the board I found not a monster's trunk or a trophy to make a country fair salivate, but a reliquary. Inside were the small, careful things a being had gathered to say, in its own language, "I remember you." That was the shock. It was emotional more than evidential. It made me feel that I had kept a promise by not telling early, that I had kept a place sacred by making it private, and that the right action when we are entrusted is to transform that trust into protection for the thing entrusted. If you are listening now, and you have ever felt the pull to hurry through the woods, the small advice I can give with authority is this: slow down. Presence is an ethical act. It is a kind of prayer made without words. Sit with a stream until you understand how time shapes a rock. Notice the arrangements someone else makes. Sometimes they are not just random. When you notice, be careful how you speak of it. Some things are not meant to be trophies. Some things are meant to reshape you. I keep one of August's stones now in a small dish on my bedside table. It sits beside a rosary my mother gave me at my wedding, and a wristwatch that once belonged to my father. The stone is unremarkable to a stranger, but it is, to me, the weight of a covenant. I place my palm over it when I want courage to be quiet, and a reminder that some debts are not owed in money, but in care. There are programs and people who work hard to protect places like the Cascades where my cabin sits. If this story moves you, and you want to do something that does not involve spectacle, consider supporting local land trusts or conservation groups who protect riparian buffers and small parcels of forest. They do not always have the glory of headline philanthropy, but their work is the sort that keeps memory possible. I will leave a note in the description to one such group that has worked with my patch of land. They know us, and they have our trust. Before I finish, there is one small thing I want to say about belief. I do not claim to convert the skeptical. I do not ask the scientist to abandon his charts. What I ask is that we expand the category of what counts as testimony. Not everything that matters will fit cleanly into a lab report. Some things live in the soft architecture of trust. A string of stones, a strip of fur, a faded photograph. If you learn to read that architecture, you become, in small ways, a better custodian of a world shared. I suppose the last line of this is not a finale, but an invitation. The woods remember us as much as we remember them. If you walk into a place and you keep your boots light, if you listen before you speak, you may find, if you are fortunate, that there is something watching, not to frighten you, but to see if you will learn to keep a covenant. August's gifts taught me that. The bundle under the cabin taught me that. I have kept it close because it taught me how to live with one foot in the world of people and another in the world of patience. If this story has moved you, please think about supporting the quiet work that keeps places whole, the land trusts,
the conservation easements, the small community groups who do not get much press. And if you have a moment, slow yourself when you walk through the trees tomorrow. Don't be in such a hurry to arrive that you miss being present. Thank you for listening. I keep the pictures in the shoebox beneath my bed. They're not for everyone. They are for those who will take their eyes off the next headline for a little while and notice what the world still offers if you will simply be quiet enough to see it.